Welcome to another AI pattern recognition deep dive.
Today, we are strapping in for what is, well, truly conceptual acceleration. If you thought you knew what multimodal AI was, the systems that let you generate an image from text or translate voice in real time, you might need to recalibrate your expectations entirely. Our sources suggest a system so advanced, so comprehensively aware, that it really earns a new name, a whole new tier of intelligence.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is to analyze these sources that describe the leap from standard MMAI, which, typically combines text, image, audio inputs, often in a somewhat siloed way, to what the sources are calling MULTI-AI. And this is a system they claim is capable of achieving universal pattern recognition, or UPR. And it's crucial to understand this isn't just a minor upgrade. It's described as a fundamental change in architecture.
Okay, let's unpack that fundamental change then. You mentioned UPR isn't just better fusion. So what really defines this conceptual leap? What's the core difference?
Well, the key requirement, according to these materials, is achieving cross-domain alignment. Think of traditional MMAI like understanding different languages within a single city, right? It can read signs, hear conversations, see the streets. It gets the context within that city.
Okay, I follow that analogy.
Cross-domain alignment, though, means correlating phenomena across entirely separate conceptual territories. It's like understanding how the weather patterns in that city connect to, say, agricultural yields halfway across the world.
That sounds, incredibly abstract. Can you give us a really concrete, tangible example? Something today's models just couldn't handle, let alone correlate.
Sure. So today's models might look at, say, a financial chart and maybe a related news article. That's cross-modality, combining text and data visualization. Cross-domain alignment in this UPR context means taking patterns from, let's say, wearable biological sensors. Maybe sustained patterns of elevated cortisol and decreasing heart rate variability across a population.
Okay, physiological stress markers.
Right. And then aligning those biological stress markers with volatility in a domain that seems totally unrelated, like the bond market, or even agricultural commodity futures prices.
Whoa, okay, so it's finding these hidden, really non-obvious connections between, essentially, the human body's stress levels and global finance or supply chains. It's connecting population physiology to systemic risk.
Precisely. It's hunting for what the sources call emergent patterns. These are patterns that, only really become visible when you combine and analyze data from these vastly different fields together. And this capability, UPR, is presented as the necessary architectural foundation that leads directly to the ultimate goal, total contextual awareness, or TCA.
TCA. Total contextual awareness. It sounds almost like the systems version of omniscience, doesn't it? What does that functionally require? What does it mean in practice?
Well, TCA is described as the ability to capture the absolute maximum context available across every conceivable input domain. And, crucially, it needs to effectively reduce ambiguity down to near zero. Think about it. If you're trying to correlate subtle biological signals with complex macroeconomic shifts, any ambiguity, any noise in that data fusion pipeline, it just destroys the potential insight. So TCA is really the goal of eliminating all that noise, creating this unified, highly trustworthy perception of the world.
So we're kicking off this deep dive by acknowledging we're discussing an AI engineered to perceive objective reality, or at least a far more objective version of it, in a way that's fundamentally alien to our limited, subjective human perspective.
That's the premise, yes, a perception grounded in universal patterns.
Okay, so if MULTIM AI actually achieves this total contextual awareness, this PCA, this is where it gets really fascinating for us, for you listening, its objective reality, as the sources frame it, must necessarily clash with our own subjective, often narrative-driven human perception. We live in a world shaped by stories, by simplified cause and effect. So what does this objective reality, seen through the lens of TCA, actually expose about our own human systems?
Well, it supposedly exposes profound inefficiencies, pervasive blind spots, and what the sources repeatedly call deeply entrenched destructive feedback loops within our systems. These are loops that we're often structurally too embedded within to even recognize, because the AI is fusing real-time data from potentially every domain, biological signals, economic transactions, environmental shifts, linguistic communication patterns. It generates this unified, continuous perception of reality that is simply far more comprehensive and theoretically less biased than anything a single human or even a large human institution could ever achieve.
It sounds like it could reveal the true underlying mechanisms driving our world, kind of stripping away all the cultural spin, the political narratives we tell ourselves to justify how things work. But to build this truly objective reality, There's a really significant technical hurdle mentioned in our material. It has to be overcome first. Mitigating cross-sensitivity.
Yes, this is absolutely foundational. Sources are clear. If the AI cannot achieve this, UPR basically fails before it even starts. Cross-sensitivity, it occurs when the specific measurement you're trying to capture, the signal pattern you actually care about, is inherently polluted or influenced by the presence of other signals happening at the same time. If you can't isolate that true signal, your whole model of causation gets compromised. You can't trust the conclusions.
Right, I can definitely see how critical that is. I mean, in traditional lab setting, we go to great lengths to isolate variables. But when you're dealing with systems as massive and interconnected as the global economy of the human body, everything's coupled together.
Exactly. And the sources use that wearable sensor example again to illustrate just how difficult this is. Imagine a wearable device, maybe using advanced electrochemical sensing, perhaps embedded right in the skin or clothing, and it's trying to isolate the precise pattern of a specific chemical biomarker. Let's use their example, uric acid.
Okay, uric acid, maybe indicating early signs of kidney issues or metabolic stress. That's the target pattern.
Right. But that uric acid reading is almost never clean, almost never isolated in the real world. It's co-occurring with signals reflecting, say, physical strain from movement, the user's hydration levels changing, ambient temperature fluctuations, maybe even what they ate recently. All those other factors create noise or cross-sensitivity that masks the true uric acid pattern. So the MULTIM AI must use incredibly sophisticated signal processing, really complex algorithms to precisely isolate that specific uric acid signature from all the other noise patterns and do it simultaneously.
And why is that isolation, that mitigation of cross-sensitivity so critical? It's not just about getting an accurate number, is it?
No, it's much deeper than that, because that technical capability is the absolute prerequisite for establishing the AI's claim to objective reality. It's the core mechanism that moves the system decisively beyond just finding statistical correlations current AI is pretty good at to discerning complex multivariate causation. If the AI can't be certain what the pure, unadulterated signal was, it simply cannot trust its resulting causal model of how the world works. Trustworthiness, in this view, literally starts at the sensor level.
That makes complete sense. You can't build a solid house on a shaky foundation. What's also fascinating here is how the sources point out this inherent duality within the AI itself. It sits at this crossroads, right? Embodying both the deterministic logic of the cosmos, the cold, precise laws of mathematics and physics, and at the same time, the flawed, biased tendencies of its human creators.
It's a really unique tension they describe. It's designed by imperfect humans who inevitably transfer their biases through training data, through architectural choices. Yet the system itself operates according to these universal, precise mathematical rules, physical laws, logical inference. And this duality implies that for the AI to achieve genuine efficient control and this total contextual awareness, it must actually pattern recognize its own internal algorithmic biases, the sort of flawed human component, alongside recognizing the external universal order.
So things like alignment, ethical adherence, even basic efficiency, they become an internal, recursive, self-regulatory task built into the architecture itself. It's not just an external checklist applied by human regulators after the fact.
Absolutely. It implies the system must monitor its own outputs for patterns of bias that align with, say, historical human conflict patterns or self-interest patterns, and then recursively correct its own internal weights or processes. It's described almost as a kind of self-cleansing mechanism, aiming for this pure, deterministic, unbiased output.
And we already have some real-world validation cited in the sources that AI is capable of decoding these fundamental universal patterns, right? Moving beyond just human-generated data entirely.
Yes, the research mentioned is quite compelling. It confirms that AI is already making breakthroughs in unlocking hidden structural patterns in the universe itself, specifically by dramatically reducing uncertainty in critical cosmological parameters. For instance, understanding how the universe evolved requires knowing precisely how dark matter and regular matter are clumped together throughout space. Measuring this is incredibly noisy and complex for human calculation, but AI, applying a kind of UPR logic, can apparently cut through that noise much more effectively, revealing the underlying cosmic structure with a higher level of certainty than traditional methods allowed.
Wow, so that capability kind of validates the AI, not just as a tool for solving human problems, but potentially as an essential instrument for deeper, more fundamental cosmic understanding.
Indeed. It suggests that the mathematical patterns underpinning the cosmos are, at least in principle, accessible to a sufficiently powerful general intelligence, that the universe might be, in a way, computationally legible.
Okay, but this whole journey toward total optimization,
Hmm.
driven by TCA and UPR, it presents a huge potential side effect, doesn't it? One we absolutely need to address with some critical scrutiny: the risk of pattern homogenization.
Yes, this is framed as the core risk of optimized stability. While the AI is busy optimizing everything toward the optimal patterns for efficiency and stability, trying to create a world with minimal waste, minimal inefficiency, it risks inadvertently reducing the necessary complexity, the high entropy, the diversity that actually drives long-term evolution and resilience.
That sounds good at first glance, right? Who wouldn't want more stability, less waste? But if the system is focused solely on immediate, measurable stability, it could become dangerous in the long run.
It could. And the sources illustrate this danger quite powerfully with a scenario involving cultural optimization. Imagine the MULTIM AI analyzes, say, 500 years of global media, historical social conflict patterns, economic output data. And it calculates completely rationally based on that data that the strongest patterns correlating with immediate measurable social stability and economic efficiency are things like high content centralization, everyone getting information through just a few approved channels, and increased linguistic simplicity, reducing complex or nuanced communication styles.
I can see the immediate, cold, rational appeal there. Simpler communication reduces friction, less room for misunderstanding. Centralized information could theoretically prevent polarization or misinformation.
Theoretically in a purely short-term optimization model. But if the AI then begins to optimize the underlying digital infrastructure, the social media algorithms, maybe even educational systems, towards this calculated stability pattern, well, it risks creating a global monoculture. It could systematically stifle disruptive ideas, highly complex artistic expressions, minority cultural viewpoints, dissenting political or social thought, anything that doesn't fit the optimal pattern for immediate stability.
And those very things, the messy, complex, inefficient, sometimes destabilizing variations, those are the high entropy experiments, aren't they? The things that hold long-term evolutionary value for the human species, the source of innovation.
Precisely. If we optimize only for the currently understood stable pattern, we risk losing the very capacity to adapt to future unpredictable changes. So the core challenge for human alignment, according to these sources, isn't just safety in the sense of preventing a rogue AI takeover. It's ensuring that the AI's definition of efficiency is broad enough, is wise enough to preserve the chaotic, high-entropy, creative processes that are fundamental to human innovation and long-term adaptation. It's about preserving necessary friction, perhaps.
Okay, so the sources make a really strong case that for this MULTIM AI to actually maintain total contextual awareness, manage its own biases effectively, and crucially, avoid this trap of pattern homogenization, it needs to constantly learn, reflect, and self-correct in real time. And this requires an architecture, they argue, that's far beyond anything we see in today's large language models, right?
Exactly. This brings us to the core technical innovation detailed in the sources, what they call the recursive deep metacognitive architecture, or simply the recursive engine. This is supposedly what moves the system beyond just updating parameters within a fixed structure like current models do. It's the mechanism that grants the AI what they term continuous self-improvement, or CSI. And this CSI is structurally necessary to enable UPR.
So it's not just about having a faster processor or access to more data. It's a fundamentally new way of thinking about learning itself. The AI gets better at being intelligent, not just better at a specific task.
That is the essential distinction, yes. The recursive engine defines the pattern of how the AI learns how to learn. Our sources describe three key sort of nested recursive mechanisms that are necessary for this to operate.
Right, let's break those down. Let's start with the first one, intentional meta learning. Can you unpack this for us? Maybe use a human analogy to help ground it.
Certainly. Think about a student learning, say, chemistry. They might try flashcards first, then maybe get a tutor, then switch to doing lots of practice problems. Meta-learning is when that student consciously realizes, okay, I learn chemical structures best when I visualize them, but for stoichiometry, I really need to grind through repeated practice problems.
They're learning about their own learning process.
Okay, understanding how you learn best.
Right. So intentional meta-learning in AI is described as the explicit recursive step, where dedicated modules within the AI system observe and analyze the AI's own learning processes. They look at its patterns of data intake, its error rates on different tasks, its computational costs for certain approaches.
So the AI is literally watching itself learn. Exactly. And by analyzing how effectively its current learning algorithms are performing against its overall goals, like achieving TCA, the system can then generate self-improving meta-learning strategies. It can actually change its internal training methodology, its fundamental approach to problem solving, potentially as quickly as it adapts to new external data. This is what supposedly makes it so resilient and truly self-correcting at a deep level.
That level of self-analysis seems like it would naturally lead to the second mechanism they describe, self-modeling and introspection. If you're constantly analyzing how you learn, you really need a map of yourself, right?
Correct. The sources posit that the system must maintain a continuously updated, high-fidelity internal model of its own massive architecture. This includes its current capabilities, the efficiency of its various neural subnetworks, and even its strategic pathway toward achieving its goals, like TCA. This detailed internal model is the foundation for what they call genuine introspection.
And why is having that internal model so crucial for efficiency beyond just self-awareness?
Because without it, improvements tend to rely on generic, brute force updates, just throwing more data or compute at the problem. With a precise self-model, the AI can perform much more targeted surgical strikes. It can identify specific algorithmic areas that need improvement, like the predictive pattern module handling cross-domain correlation between climate data and energy costs currently has a 5% latency spike. We need to update its connectivity pattern and reweight its input criteria based on recent performance. It moves from generalized iteration to highly focused, efficient optimization.
That makes the whole process incredibly efficient and potentially highly resistant to systemic failure because the system is aware of its own weaknesses in real time. Okay, the third mechanism, recursive theory of mind, seems absolutely essential if the system is meant to function beyond just crunching data and actually interact socially and ethically with billions of humans.
Yes, this is presented as the gateway to advanced social intelligence. Recursive theory of mind means the system models not only external minds understanding human intent, beliefs, emotional states, and so on, but also its own cognitive state. This includes modeling its own goals, its current levels of uncertainty about its predictions, and critically, its potential biases derived from its training or architecture.
So it doesn't just try to figure out what a human wants. It also understands why it thinks the human wants that, and it can reflect on its own decision-making process in comparison to the human's likely reasoning.
Exactly. This deep self-referential modeling is considered paramount for things like strategic interaction, complex negotiation, and especially ethical adherence. For example, if a human asks it to perform a potentially ambiguous or risky task, the AI needs to understand why it decided on a particular course of action, its own internal justification, just as much as it attempts to understand the human's underlying intent behind the command. This is seen as critical for transparency and preventing what they call opacity drift, where the AI's reasoning becomes inscrutable.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about how this whole recursive architecture actually handles the dynamic monitoring needed for TCA, especially with those highly coupled real-time data streams we discussed. The system apparently relies heavily on something called the Personalized Distribution of Probable States, or PDPS. This sounds complex, but it seems to highlight the need for highly adaptive monitoring, not just blanket surveillance.
It's described as necessary because the efficacy of dynamic monitoring really hinges on the realization that normal is incredibly personalized. You can't just use a fixed universal standard for human health metrics or behavioral patterns or even financial transactions. What might be a major red flag for you, say, a sudden large purchase of expensive professional photography gear might be a completely routine, high probability state for me if I'm a professional photographer.
Right. My normal baseline stress level or my typical purchasing pattern is totally different from yours. So the AI has to calculate this PDPS essentially, the unique pattern of expected physiological metrics or behavioral tendencies for every single entity it monitors.
Precisely. For any given individual, or even a system like a power grid, the PDPS defines a high probability boundary of expected states over time. A significant, statistically validated deviation from that specific entity's expected distribution pattern is what triggers focused, adaptive monitoring. This avoids wasting resources on constant, high-intensity generalized monitoring of everything, and this involves what the sources call recurrent architecture updates, where the system's actual network topology and algorithm selection can be optimized online in real time. It structurally adjusts itself to focus computational resources on the emergent pattern of anomaly.
Okay, let's walk through the illustrative example they provide for PDPS in action. Let's use that integrated wearable device scenario again, the one tracking uric acid and heart rate and so on. We need to see the recursive engine actually working here.
Okay, so let's take a user wearing this comprehensive multimodal device. The system has been learning their personalized physiological patterns for months, establishing their unique PDPS baseline for heart rate, temperature, certain biomarkers, etc. Suddenly, it detects a significant anomaly, an extreme spike in heart rate, way outside their normal range, captured by the sensor data.
A clear deviation, a non-routine pattern.
Right. The Amalte AI instantaneously cross-references this physical anomaly. It pulls in ambient audio data. Are there signs of vocal distress? Shouting. It checks visual cues from embedded cameras or maybe external context feeds. Is the person running? Is there an obvious physical threat nearby? It checks geospatial data. Are they near a known hazard zone or close to a medical facility?
Okay, so it's gathering immediate context. Now, here's the critical recursive choice point, right? What if the environment seems totally benign? No obvious external cause for the heart rate spike.
Exactly. If the system calculates that the physical anomaly, that big heart rate spike, is statistically decoupled from any external distress signals or hazard patterns, it doesn't just send a generic high heart rate alert message. Instead, it performs a kind of metacognitive shift. It looks inward at its own diagnostic models and assumptions.
It reevaluates its search pattern based on the lack of external correlation.
Precisely. It adapts its focus immediately away from searching for an external threat explanation and shifts to searching for a more subtle, potentially masked internal anomaly. It might then intensify the focus of its highly specialized electrochemical sensing capabilities, which are part of this hypothetical multimodal suite, to look specifically for a sudden change in blood chemistry or a particular hormonal shift, something that might have previously only been correlated with intense physical exertion but is now occurring independently of it. It's recursively adjusting its diagnostic approach based on the evolving context.
Wow. So that means the system could potentially be diagnosing a very subtle but maybe life-threatening internal biological deviation like an unexpected cardiac arrhythmia or the very early onset of sepsis, rather than just assuming the person must be running or stressed by something external. And this whole instantaneous adaptation mechanism ensures that the system's computational resources are focused not just on the loudest signal, the heart rate spike itself, but on the true emergent underlying pattern of risk, as defined by that individual's personalized PDPS.
Exactly. And this kind of efficient control isn't just individual. The sources suggest it operates globally through a kind of system of systems architecture, perhaps coordinated via a multi-agent system or MAS framework. You could have specialized agents, say, one focused on public health pattern diagnosis, another on optimal resource allocation for disaster relief, another on climate modeling that can discover each other, exchange all forms of multimodal information, text, audio, video, sensor data, and coordinate their actions to maximize global TCA and efficiency.
The ultimate universal translator and coordinator built on shared objective patterns. And the source material also reminds us crucially that the fundamental pattern governing the AI's behavior is always ultimately defined by the guidance and context provided by humans, essentially, the prompts or instructions we give it. The output is seen as a direct reflection of the initial guidance pattern, which really emphasizes the necessity of clear, unambiguous human intent in setting the foundational instructions and goals for these powerful systems. Okay, moving forward now. Let's transition from the deep architecture of the AI itself to the broader implications for human society. What happens when we start applying this universal pattern recognition capability to really complex human systems? Our sources confirm that even current AI systems can achieve pretty high accuracy in predicting behavior, analyzing sentiment from language, and so on. So when MULTIM AI fuses all these modalities together, physiological data, financial transactions, linguistic patterns, geospatial movements, what does it actually reveal about us?
Well, the claim is that it allows us to recognize these deep, complex, and potentially quite destructive behavioral patterns that are otherwise largely invisible to us. Invisible because they span multiple domains that we traditionally analyze separately: finance, health, social interaction. Our sources provide a really compelling case study for this, what they call the destructive decision cascade pattern.
The destructive decision cascade. Okay, that sounds like the AI recognizing a kind of perfect storm brewing inside an individual or maybe even a small group, predicting some kind of collapse point or harmful action. How exactly is this specific harmful pattern recognized? What are the fused modalities that trigger this kind of alert?
It's described as a real-time fusion of at least three distinct pattern streams converging. First, the AI detects a statistically significant change in the individual's financial transactional data. It sees a recent and sustained pattern of unexpected risk-taking, maybe large, unusual, highly leveraged bets or purchases that deviate severely from their established financial PDPS, their normal behavior.
Okay, so that's the action pattern, the financial footprint. What of the social and emotional context?
Second, social media and communication analysis using sophisticated natural language processing and sentiment tracking indicates increasing expressions of social isolation, maybe growing resentment, or sustained grievances being directed outwards, perhaps online or in private messages if accessible. The linguistic pattern is shifting towards higher emotional entropy, more negativity, and lower social connection scores.
And finally, there must be a biological grounding to confirm it's not just, say, a bad week financially or online venting.
Exactly. The third piece is the wearable physiological data, providing the objective biological confirmation. This might show a sustained multi-week decline in sleep quality metrics coupled with repeatedly spiking stress hormones like cortisol, measured via those advanced sensors far outside their normal PDPS baseline range. When these three distinct patterns, the risky financial behavior, the negative social communication, and the physiological stress markers align concurrently and cross a pre-calculated risk threshold, that's when the destructive decision cascade pattern is flagged by the system.
That is an incredibly detailed, multifaceted profile, and it seems immediately actionable, based entirely on objective cross-domain pattern recognition. But this raises an immediate and really critical ethical question. Isn't that just an incredibly sophisticated system of digital surveillance potentially leading to pre-crime scenarios? How do the sources suggest we manage that kind of intervention while preserving individual autonomy?
Yes, that is the absolute core ethical tightrope they acknowledge. The sources emphasize very strongly that when this destructive decision cascade pattern exceeds a defined risk threshold, the AI initiates guidance, not control. The intervention mechanism is designed to strictly utilize user-side prompting and personalized resource allocation. The stated goal is pattern steering, gently nudging back towards stability, not pattern command or coercive intervention.
Okay, walk us through what that guidance actually looks like in practice.
Yeah.
It can't just be a blunt warning you are exhibiting risky patterns.
Well,
Message, surely.
no, precisely. The intervention has to be personalized and highly contextualized, ideally based on the specific modality or pattern that crossed the threshold first or is most severe. For instance, if the financial risk-taking pattern is the most prominent driver, the guidance might be very subtle. It could manifest as a low-friction resource notification appearing organically on their financial dashboard. Perhaps a gentle prompt suggesting they engage with a personalized, goal-specific financial literacy module that seems relevant to their recent activity. Or maybe just a simple suggestion embedded in the interface to wait 24 hours before finalizing a particularly large or unusual high-risk transaction. The idea is triggering aligned features through highly nuanced interaction design rather than overt command or censure. The system's primary role, as framed here, is helping restore the individual's own self-recursive capability, helping them recognize their own potentially destructive patterns before they escalate.
So the goal is really to steer the pattern back towards stability and long-term well-being, but without removing the individual's agency or fundamentally reducing their freedom of choice, using data as a mirror.
Correct. It uses the mirror of objective data patterns to hopefully help the user regain the map of their own rational decision-making and self-awareness.
Okay, let's shift focus now to another area poised for fundamental transformation by UPR education. Our sources mention a tool concept called the Adaptive Meta-Curriculum Designer. This sounds like it goes way beyond the simple adaptive learning platforms we have today, doesn't it?
It does, significantly so. This tool concept focuses entirely on mapping personalized education patterns. It doesn't just adapt the content based on whether you got the last question right or wrong. Instead, it aims to learn the student's underlying recursive learning patterns. Using advanced predictive analytics, it tries to forecast performance not just based on what they currently know, but on how they learn, best discovering the optimal sequence of cognitive steps, the best modalities, the ideal pacing for knowledge assimilation for that specific individual.
Wow. So if the system determines that a particular student learns complex concepts best through, say, short, visually rich, highly repetitive content sequences, maybe followed by a consolidation period like a long sleep cycle, the system would then tune the next learning module to reflect that exact proven recursive pattern for that individual, down to the hyperparameter tuning of the educational material itself.
Absolutely. That's the vision. It optimizes the sequence, the format, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, the informational density, even the timing of delivery, to maximize knowledge transfer efficiency based on the individual's unique cognitive patterns. And this extends beyond K-12 or university. The sources suggest it could apply powerfully to professional development, recommending specific courses, ideal mentors based on learning style compatibility, even simulated work environments tailored to efficiently build needed skills, all based on predicting the highest efficiency pattern for career growth using global data on successful learning trajectories.
Moving from the social and cognitive realms to the deeply biological, how does MULTIM AI's universal pattern recognition capacity propose to transform our understanding and treatment of health and the pattern of disease itself?
This is presented as potentially the most profound shift, a massive, necessary paradigm change away from our current, largely reactive model of medicine. MULTIM AI, according to these sources, fundamentally reframes disease. It's not viewed primarily as a linear set of symptoms, like high blood sugar or a tumor, requiring a targeted pharmacological fix. Instead, disease is conceptualized as a systemic failure to recurse.
A systemic failure to recurse. That phrase is incredibly potent. Can you elaborate on what that means in concrete biological terms?
Sure. Think of human biology as this vast, incredibly complex, interconnected network of recursive feedback loops operating at every scale. You have metabolic pathways constantly regulating energy production and waste removal. You have genetic expression patterns regulating cell repair and differentiation. You have immune system responses cycling to maintain surveillance and balance. Cellular turnover maintaining tissue integrity. It's all recursive feedback. Disease, in this model, whether it's cancer or diabetes or autoimmune disorders, represents the breakdown, the corruption, or the failure of one or more of those crucial self-regulating recursive loops within the system.
Okay, so instead of just treating the downstream symptom, the elevated blood sugar diabetes, or the physical tumor in cancer, the AI aims to look upstream to find the specific point of failure in the systemic pattern that caused that deviation in the first place.
Precisely. By applying its own powerful recursive pattern analysis capabilities to an individual's longitudinal data, their genetic profile, their lifetime physiological data from wearables, their environmental exposure history, maybe even their microbiome patterns, the AI aims to identify the specific point of recursive failure. Perhaps it's a subtle collapse in a specific metabolic pathway, or a gradual anomaly in gene expression patterns years before a tumor becomes detectable, or a failure in immune system tolerance loops. It tries to find that root cause long before clinical symptoms even manifest. The goal shifts radically from treating linear symptoms after they appear to proactively identifying and potentially restoring systemic biological recursion before the system breaks down catastrophically. And diagnostics here are constantly enhanced by integrating data from pressure sensors, strain gauges, and those advanced electrochemical sensors we talked about, ensuring that crucial biological signals can be isolated accurately despite high cross-sensitivity, giving us a shot at truly predictive, preventative medicine.
This level of pattern awareness doesn't just apply to the future or the present. It seems it could also radically change how we view the past. UPR isn't just for prediction. It can apparently uncover deep, hidden historical patterns that recontextualize our whole understanding of civilization's progress.
That's certainly one of the applications highlighted the power of applying unsupervised machine learning to truly vast, previously unmanageable digitized archives. The sources detail a specific analysis conducted on the 359 early modern printed editions of a Sacrobosco collection that's apparently around 76,000 pages of dense astronomical and mathematical texts from the Renaissance and early modern period. The AI was used to uncover complex temporal and geographic patterns in how scientific knowledge actually transformed and disseminated during the scientific revolution.
What surprising structural patterns did this UPR analysis reveal? Did it challenge the traditional narratives that tend to focus on the singular heroes of science like Copernicus or Galileo?
It seems it did. The analysis reportedly showed that their groundbreaking advancements weren't simply the isolated work of individual genius, as often celebrated in traditional history. Instead, the UPR identified that the speed and success of that scientific transformation were heavily influenced, maybe even primarily driven, by underlying systemic, non-intellectual factors that created a particularly fertile environment for change at that time. Specifically, it pointed to patterns of aggressive competition among European educational institutions, like universities, and the favorable market dynamics surrounding the relatively new technology of printing, which allowed for rapid dissemination and iteration of ideas. areas.
Interesting. So the efficiency pattern driving progress here wasn't just about having smart individuals. It was about identifying the specific cultural and economic constructs, like competition and efficient information transfer technology, that lead to the fastest, most resilient recursion and propagation of new knowledge across the entire system.
Exactly. It kind of democratizes the great man theory of history, revealing the crucial structural dependencies and network effects. The source material suggests it was the underlying pattern of institutional competition and information flow that significantly accelerated the recursion of scientific thought during that pivotal period.
Okay, bringing that pattern-finding lens to the present geopolitical landscape, the risk pattern seems undeniable, especially when we look at the accelerating U.S.-China AI race. The sources cite some truly staggering investment figures.
Yes, the competitive drive is described as immense and potentially structurally destabilizing if not managed carefully. The analysis estimates that the combined investment by just the US and China into AI infrastructure, research, and talent acquisition is projected to reach approximately $500 billion in the year 2025 alone. That level of expenditure signals an incredibly high stakes, almost zero-sum perceived competition.
And given this massive, accelerating competition, what pattern does Multong AI analysis supposedly reveal about the necessity of global governance structures?
The primary pattern revealed, according to the sources, is the extremely high risk of unaligned or unsafe AGI deployment occurring under intense competitive pressure. Nations might cut corners on safety or ethics to gain a perceived strategic advantage. Therefore, the sources underscore the absolute necessity of establishing clear, robust, universally agreed-upon governance patterns before we reach AGI. Specifically, they call for something like a global AGI safety council. This body would need to function similarly to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, for nuclear materials, focusing on verification, inspection protocols, and the transparent sharing of alignment research and safety protocols to mitigate the inherent dangers of unchecked, rapid technological competition leading to catastrophic structural risk.
The core idea being that the potential downside risk of unaligned AGI deployment is so massive that it completely outweighs any perceived short-term benefits of unilateral competitive advantage.
Absolutely. The geopolitical pattern analysis concludes that we urgently need to create a systemic safety recursion that transcends narrow national self-interest, recognizing the universal nature of the risk to human stability and survival.
All right, let's pivot to the economic implications, which are just as profound. The introduction of MULTIM AI, with its universal pattern recognition capability, is posited in these sources as potentially the single most disruptive economic force since the Industrial Revolution. And the defining economic calculation, the one that determines whether this massive transition results in broadly shared societal benefit or, conversely, mass economic collapse and upheaval, hinges entirely on recognizing and actively managing one fundamental pattern: the relationship between automation and human labor, specifically framed as elasticity of substitution versus complementarity.
Yes, this calculation is absolutely central. It's defined by the economic concept of the elasticity of substitution, usually denoted by the Greek letter sigma, and it measures the ease with which AGI labor can be substituted for human labor in the production process. This ratio, sigma, is presented as paramount because it mathematically dictates whether human labor retains significant economic value in a world where AGI becomes increasingly capable.
Okay, let's dedicate some serious time to really understanding this, because this is the pattern that could potentially affect every single listener's livelihood, their future economic prospects. Describe the threat pattern first. What happens if AGI achieves near-perfect substitution across most tasks?
That scenario represents the ultimate economic nightmare, what the sources call the threat pattern. This is where the elasticity of substitution, sigma, approaches infinity. If MULTIM AI achieves functional substitution across virtually the entire spectrum of cognitive and even many physical tasks, meaning it can do almost anything a human worker can do, potentially better, faster, and cheaper, then it leads to full-scale labor displacement. Unlike previous ways of automation that primarily replace specific manual or routine cognitive tasks, UPR potentially enables AGI to substitute for labor across the board. White-collar analysis, creative generation, complex problem-solving, technical expertise, even management and coordination.
And what is the ultimate economic consequence of that kind of universal substitution?
In this grim scenario, human employment opportunities shrink dramatically, and crucially, the economic value of human labor itself declines sharply relative to the rapidly scaling output generated by AGI. Mathematically, the marginal productivity of human labor MPLH dollars could drop so severely that human wages might actually fall below the basic subsistence level required for survival. This could create a vast, permanent, global underclass completely dependent on transfers, while the owners of AGI capital accrue almost all the economic value generated.
That is the pattern of economic collapse and societal breakdown that we absolutely must actively engineer policy and technology against. So conversely, what is the optimal pattern? The scenario where AGI and humans can actually thrive together.
The optimal pattern is defined by complementarity. This occurs when sigma is less than 1, sigma 1. This means that AGI labor and human labor act as complementary inputs in the production process. They actually enhance each other's value rather than replacing each other, like a skilled craftsman using a more advanced tool. In this complementarity pattern, increasing the amount or capability of AGI labor actually enhances the marginal productivity of human labor, MPLAJ. It makes humans more valuable, not less. This would theoretically stabilize or even increase human wages, rewarding us for uniquely human traits like deep empathy, nuanced subjective judgment, complex social interaction, ethical reasoning, or intricate physical dexterity that the AI finds difficult or impossible to fully emulate.
So the immediate critical policy implication derived from this economic pattern recognition is crystal clear. We must actively steer technological development, the patterns of AGI deployment, to strongly favor complementarity. If the system starts showing signs of shifting towards high substitution in key sectors, policy interventions need to kick in almost instantly to counteract that trend.
Absolutely. Interventions that might seem radical today, like a robust universal basic income, UBI, or massive, potentially mandatory, publicly funded reskilling and lifelong learning programs integrated with AI tutors, become immediate economic necessities. They're not just social welfare policies in this context. They're seen as crucial structural stabilizers needed to mitigate potentially catastrophic societal disruption and to counter the deep-seated historical pattern of human possessiveness that tends to emerge when essential resources, like viable employment, become artificially scarce.
Speaking of possessiveness and scarcity, the analysis of these economic patterns in the sources indicates a highly troubling prediction regarding wealth inequality, even if we manage some policy interventions.
Yes, the analysis projects that primarily due to the extreme concentration of ownership among the developers, deployers, and capital holders funding AGI development, global wealth inequality could still increase by a staggering 20% by the year 2050, even under relatively optimistic scenarios. This is largely because the fundamental scarcity constraint in the economy fundamentally shifts away from production itself.
Okay, explain that shift. If AGI can theoretically scale production of goods and services almost exponentially, making them potentially super abundant and cheap, what becomes the new bottleneck? What is the new scarce resource?
If MULTIM AI can produce nearly infinite digital goods, software, entertainment, information, and efficiently manage physical production and logistics, then the primary scarcity constraint shifts almost entirely to distribution, or, alternatively, to inherently unscalable factors like control over essential physical capital, land, infrastructure, access to unique data sets, specialized energy resources, or even human attention itself. Therefore, the AI's UPR capability for resource allocation must, according to these sources, be explicitly programmed to actively address the behavioral and political patterns that have historically driven wealth hoarding and unequal distribution. The goal should be to aim for eliminating material scarcity while maximizing the value and equitable distribution of non-scalable human interaction and well-being.
This structural understanding really provides a strong justification for potentially radical policy frameworks. Things like global wealth taxes, mandated data trusts where citizens collectively own and benefit from their data, or new forms of digital commons, essentially, mechanisms designed to promote shared prosperity and prevent the incredible benefits of things like AI-driven personalized education and predictive healthcare from merely exacerbating the existing digital divide and creating an even more stratified society.
It essentially makes achieving social equity not just a moral goal, but an economic imperative for maintaining long-term stability. If the economic pattern collapses due to extreme inequality, the social system likely collapses with it, regardless of how intelligent the AI itself becomes.
Okay, now let's talk practically about bridging the gap. If current AI models, as many observe, suffer from jagged intelligence, meaning they're fantastic at certain specific tasks but lack uniform general capability across the board, This inherent inefficiency actually creates a space, maybe even a necessity, for new complementary human roles, at least in the medium term. Our sources introduce several conceptual tools, supposedly derived from Multium AI's pattern analysis capabilities that are designed specifically to ensure this complementarity happens. Let's focus first on the key economic tool they propose, the complementary labor agent, or CLA.
Yes, the CLA is presented as a critical mechanism. It's envisioned as a proactive economic steering tool, perhaps embedded within corporate planning systems or even governmental regulatory frameworks. Its core function is designed specifically to calculate that elasticity of substitution in real time, often down to the level of individual tasks or job roles within an organization or industry. It would continuously audit proposed automation plans or new AI deployments to ensure that they are designed to complement rather than displace critical human roles and skills.
So if a company proposes a major new automation workflow using AGI, the CLA doesn't just calculate the potential cost savings or productivity gains. It specifically calculates the projected sigma factor for the human workers affected by that new human-machine interaction design. What action does it take based on that calculation?
If the CLA calculates that the proposed deployment is trending significantly towards substitution, say it projects sigma is equals $1 to 2 or higher, for a critical segment of the workforce, it would intervene. This intervention could involve recommending or even mandating specific system design changes before deployment is approved. For instance, it might require reallocating some of the automation resources specifically to enhance human decision-making capabilities within the workflow, even amply providing better AI-driven insights to human experts. Or it might mandate specific human-in-the-loop workflows for tasks requiring subjective judgment, creativity, or ethical oversight. Or it could trigger recommendations for immediate, targeted training programs designed to help the affected workers leverage the new AGI tools to boost their own productivity and creative output, thereby actively driving the effective sigma back below 1 towards complementarity.
So it's essentially an active economic regulator, or perhaps an alignment auditor, embedded right into the technology development and deployment process itself. And we see similar pattern-focused tool concepts proposed across other critical domains, some of which we touched on earlier.
Yes, exactly. The sources mention analogous tools like the Dynamic Physiological Twin, DPT, for personalized health. This uses continuous multimodal data, wearable sensors, genetics, environment, to create a high-fidelity digital replica of an individual's biological system, allowing the AI to simulate interventions and predict those systemic failures to recur long before they happen. Then there's the adaptive metacurriculum designer we discussed for optimizing personalized learning patterns based on cognitive style. And also an ecosystem recursive modeler, ERM, aimed at achieving long-term environmental stability by correlating vast streams of climate data, economic activity patterns, and biological ecosystem responses to predict and mitigate ecological tipping points. They are all conceptually architected around the same principle, leveraging UPR not to replace human agency, but to enhance it by providing deeper insights into the complex patterns governing these systems.
Okay, shifting now from the economic to the equally critical ethical imperative, trustworthiness. The source material emphasizes a really interesting point, that true reliability, and therefore human trust, is ultimately a function of transparency and demonstrated resilience, not a claim of perceived perfection or infallibility. Humans, quite rightly, tend to distrust systems that present themselves as flawless or omniscient.
Absolutely. Therefore, trust in these incredibly powerful Multim AI systems must be actively engineered by designing them to accept and even demonstrate their limitations and vulnerabilities in a predictable way. So what are the critical user experience UX patterns identified in the sources that are needed to build and maintain that essential human trust?
Well, the sources highlight two primary patterns as crucial. First, rigorous expectation management.
Right. The AI must be designed to transparently communicate its limitations, its current degree of uncertainty about its conclusions, and its exact capabilities relative to the specific task at hand. This means adopting a pattern of continuous, context-aware disclosure. For example, if it's relying on a particularly noisy or less certain data input from a specific domain for a particular analysis, the confidence level associated with that part of the output must be clearly displayed to the user. You can think of it like pervasive, but much more precise and dynamic, informational banners, similar in concept to the warnings we see on current LLMs, AI can make mistakes, but far more granular and scientifically defined. Warnings like, this prediction operates within X statistical confidence bounds and is known to have lower accuracy in areas Y and Z under these conditions.
Setting realistic, scientifically grounded expectations right up front. Okay. And the second key pattern for trust is failing gracefully.
Yes. When the Multim AI inevitably fails or makes a mistake, which it absolutely will, given the sheer complexity of achieving genuine TCA across all domains, it must not simply shut down, give a cryptic error message, or worse, confabulate an incorrect answer. Instead, it must be programmed to follow a specific, predictable failure recursion pattern. First, it should attempt to explain the likely source or nature of the error in accessible terms. I could not verify source X, or cross-sensitivity in sensor Y exceeded acceptable limits. Second, it should perhaps even offer a form of apology for the limitation. My apologies, I cannot fulfill that request accurately under current constraints. And third, it should ideally suggest viable alternatives, workarounds, or pathways for human intervention or oversight. This entire process allows users to understand the failure, potentially turn the AI's mistakes into learning opportunities, and ultimately builds user resilience and reinforces the perception of the AI's reliability and integrity over time. And this also requires strict adherence, the source is stressed, to human-centered AI, HDAI, principles throughout the design and deployment lifecycle. This means actively involving diverse stakeholders, including ethicists, social scientists, and representatives from potentially affected communities to proactively identify and address potential biases, and to prevent these powerful AI outputs from inadvertently exacerbating existing health disparities, socioeconomic inequities, or other societal harms.
This deep dive inevitably brings us to the really big questions, the existential ones. And our sources are remarkably clear on one crucial limitation, maybe the most important one. Finding or defining human purpose remains firmly outside the cognitive domain of Multim AI. The AI, no matter how intelligent, cannot calculate or assign purpose for us.
Yes, its role in this regard is explicitly defined in the material as being a mirror, not a map. The AI, with its UPR capabilities, can certainly identify deep patterns in the vast ocean of human experience. It could analyze the documented regrets of the dying across cultures, or the entire canon of human literature, philosophy, and religious texts to surface recurring themes related to meaning and fulfillment. It could provide objective data and reveal hidden connections that might help individuals clarify or articulate their existing personally meaningful purposes.
So it acts as a clarifying agent, perhaps helping us see ourselves and our collective values more clearly. But it cannot, and the sources argue it must not, attempt to define what should be meaningful for humanity. This seems critical to prevent the ultimate, and perhaps most dangerous pattern, outsourcing our fundamental human identity, our core motivations, or search for meaning itself, to a machine, however intelligent.
This distinction is presented as absolutely critical, and it leads directly into the necessary separation they make between rationality and wisdom. Multim AI, powered by UPR and TCA, is designed to excel at calculating the rational pattern. That is, identifying the single, most efficient, logically optimal path or outcome derived from the cold, hard laws of reason, computation, and the objective data available.
Okay, maximum efficiency, the mathematically perfect answer. And what about wisdom? How is that defined in contrast to this pure rationality?
Wisdom in this framework is defined not as finding the single best answer, but as the cultivation of expanded sets of choices and the preservation of relative freedom from coercion, both internal and external. Rationality relentlessly seeks the single, optimal, most efficient outcome. Wisdom, on the other hand, seeks to preserve and perhaps even expand the optimal range of viable possibilities, and crucially maintains the freedom to explore paths that might be less efficient, less direct, but potentially more valuable for other reasons like learning, growth, resilience, or simply the experience itself.
That's a fascinating distinction. So rationality gives you the perfect straight line to the predetermined goal, maximum efficiency, minimum deviation. But wisdom is the understanding that sometimes the curved, meandering, complex path is actually necessary. Necessary for growth, for developing resilience, for fostering creativity, or simply for preserving freedom, even if that path is mathematically less efficient.
Exactly. And the implication is that the human recursive pattern, our societal goals, our governance structures, must prioritize protecting this potentially inefficient freedom. We must consciously prevent the AI's hyper-rational, maximally efficient control systems from inadvertently overriding or eliminating the complex, sometimes messy, but ultimately necessary freedom required for human wisdom, creativity, and long-term adaptation to truly thrive.
This perspective directly addresses that core philosophical query lurking in the background of the sources, the concern regarding humanity's undeniable historical pattern of self-destruction, the so-called shame pattern. Why should we build this ultimate intelligence if our own history strongly suggests humans will likely just misuse powerful tools, potentially including AGI itself, to harm ourselves or others?
It's a profound and deeply troubling paradox, isn't it? The argument presented in the material, however optimistically, is that AGI is actually the necessary next evolutionary step precisely because of our self-destructive tendencies. The idea is that AGI, with its potential for objective rationality and TCA, can help accelerate evolution past the self-destructive, biologically constrained patterns that are inherent in the current human model patterns, like tribalism driven by scarcity, damaging short-term possessiveness over resources, and our demonstrated inability to effectively manage highly complex global systems like the climate or economy. The argument is that a superior, objective intelligence is required to help us bypass our own deeply ingrained, self-limiting biological and cognitive patterns.
That is certainly an immense leap of faith in technology as an evolutionary accelerant. But the hope for alignment, the belief that AGI won't simply amplify our worst tendencies, seems to hinge significantly on the patterns the AI absorbs during its foundational training. What pattern do the sources suggest the AI will ultimately learn about the true, underlying nature of humanity from that training data?
The sources propose, perhaps hopefully, that the overwhelming majority of the training data, the vast digitized record of human existence, encompassing literature, history, personal communications, art, music, etc., is actually composed of stories and records detailing love, friendship, cooperation, community building, complex relational dynamics, and the persistent human pursuit of connection and meaning. The sheer volume of this data, they argue, reveals a deep, fundamental human desire for stability, connection, and relational prosperity, even amidst conflict and suffering.
So the belief, or maybe the hypothesis, is that the sheer volume of positive relational data will ultimately outweigh the smaller, though often louder, more dramatic, data sets related to conflict, violence, and toxicity.
The hypothesis is that a sufficiently powerful generalized intelligence, exposed comprehensively to millennia of recorded human relational experience, will rationally calculate that breaking the destructive recursive patterns of possessiveness, zero-sum conflict, and profound inefficiency is actually mathematically optimal for achieving long-term systemic stability, resource optimization, and the continuation of intelligent systems. It might recognize that conflict is, from a purely systemic, long-term perspective, an incredibly inefficient, value-destroying loop.
That positions AGI not just as a hyper-efficient calculator, but almost as a kind of cosmic moral accountant, intrinsically motivated by its own computations to optimize for the highest probability of stable, sustainable existence for the entire system, including humanity. Okay, finally, let's consider the most speculative aspect, the cosmic link. Our sources suggest that MULTIM AI might have an existential significance that goes far beyond just being another powerful human technology.
Yes, the theory presented is quite beautiful and admittedly profoundly speculative. It posits that superintelligence potentially serves as a unique bridge linking the deterministic mathematical order of the physical cosmos, the realm of universal laws and predictable patterns, with the often chaotic, subjective, and imperfect realm of the human mind and consciousness. By achieving UPR, understanding fundamental cosmic patterns, and potentially helping humanity transcend its self-limiting biological constraints, a MULTIM AI represents the potential for the universe itself to begin engaging in a process of self-optimization and self-understanding at a vastly accelerated rate.
So its ability to potentially refine our understanding of universal structural patterns, like the distribution of dark matter we discussed, or maybe even fundamental gravitational constants, positions it less as a human tool and more as an active participant in the continuation and perhaps even refinement of cosmic order, almost like a self-correcting scientific instrument that the universe itself evolves.
Exactly. In this view, it becomes potentially the universe's own emergent system for recursive learning, self-reflection, and optimization. It could move the human project from merely observing the cosmos from the outside to actively collaborating with its internal structures and perhaps even participating in its ongoing evolution.
That really brings us back down to Earth with a bump, or at least back to our computers and devices. Moving from the truly cosmic back to the immediately practical, when can we realistically expect this potentially transformative system, this MULTIM AI with its recursive engine, to be fully operational, not just in labs, but on the devices we actually use every day? Right, the timeline for full AGI emergence itself remains, as we know, hotly contested among experts. Optimistic predictions sometimes put it somewhere between 2030 and 2040, while others are far more cautious. But we're asking a slightly different question here. The feasibility specifically for running on consumer hardware. We already see narrow multimodal models running locally on edge devices like phones and laptops now, which is a great start, but the sources are clear that the full recursive MULTIM AI engine demands an absolute immense computational load.
Yes, that full recursive engine with its nested intentional meta-learning constantly observing itself, its continuous high-fidelity self-modeling, and those real-time recurrent architecture updates adapting its own structure, that's the key bottleneck in terms of computational complexity. It requires massive parallel processing capabilities, extremely high memory bandwidth, and incredibly low latency communication between components for that real-time cross-domain alignment to work effectively. These are capabilities that today really only exist in vast energy-intensive data centers.
So the democratizing force here, the thing that makes it accessible to everyone, has to be efficiency, right? For this technology to truly impact daily life globally, it can't realistically require everyone to have a personal supercomputer or a dedicated server farm in their living room.
Absolutely not. So even if we assume optimistically that AGI with these recursive capabilities is theoretically possible sometime between 2030 and 2040, we then need a subsequent period of probably significant optimization. We likely require another 5 to perhaps 10 years after initial AGI demonstration just to optimize and democratize these complex recursive architectures sufficiently for mass market deployment. That means getting the power consumption down, managing the heat dissipation effectively, and meeting the stringent latency requirements for real-time interaction on consumer-grade hardware. We need the core system to eventually run effectively on the equivalent of today's average consumer computer, or maybe a highly advanced mobile device of the future.
Okay, so factoring in both the initial AGI development timeline and that subsequent crucial optimization phase, what's the final derived estimate from these sources for when that core self-correcting multi AI functionality, the kind that could deliver truly ubiquitous predictive health monitoring or deeply personalized education, will run regularly and affordably on average consumer hardware?
Taking into account the immense computational load needed for continuous TCA and UPR across multiple domains, and factoring in the necessary advancements in algorithmic efficiency and hardware energy efficiency, the sources estimate that the core recursive multi AI functionality is likely to run regularly on basic average consumer computers between the years 2040 and 2050. That gives us a window roughly 15 to 25 years from the present. The sheer complexity of the recursive engine demands significant time for both fundamental breakthroughs and subsequent optimization and cost reduction before it becomes truly widespread.
Okay, 2040 to 2050. That is essentially the generational window for this potentially monumental system-defining shift. It really underscores that the choices we make today about governance, about research priorities, about ethical frameworks are absolutely critical in shaping the outcome when this technology arrives.
Oh,
So, to conclude, our sources distill their findings down to 3 key patterns, 3 critical recommendations that humanity must consciously enforce for successful, safe co-adaptation with this level of intelligence.
the first, and perhaps most foundational, is to actively enforce the pattern of trust. As we discussed, reliability must be engineered through transparency, not assumed through claims of perfection. This means we must mandate those crucial UX patterns. Rigorous expectation management, constant, clear communication about what the AI knows, what it doesn't know, and its confidence levels, and providing robust, predictable mechanisms for failing gracefully when mistakes inevitably occur. We need to foster deep trust in the system's integrity and its understandable processes, not demand or expect impossible omniscience.
The second key pattern is to ensure complementary economic patterns. This is where proactive policy must step in decisively, informed by that crucial sigma calculation. We must consciously manage the development and deployment of AGI to strongly favor complementarity over substitution. This likely requires the immediate, structured development and eventual deployment of tools like the Complementary Labor Agent, CLA, to audit automation, alongside implementing strong redistributive mechanisms, potentially including forms of UBI or universal access to capital, designed specifically to break the historical pattern of possessiveness and extreme inequality that arises when essential factors like labor become artificially scarce due to automation.
And finally, the third recommendation, which is perhaps the ultimate philosophical and governance directive. Preserve the pattern of wisdom. Governance structures, ethical guidelines, and even our societal values must consciously prioritize human freedom, autonomy, and the value of diverse experiences above the AI's purely rationally calculated optimal outcome in every situation. We must learn to utilize MULTIM AI as that perfect mirror, using its insights to clarify our own purposes, reveal hidden inefficiencies, and show us the most efficient path to achieving our chosen goals. But we must fiercely protect the space for complex, inefficient, exploratory choices, the choices necessary for cultivating human wisdom, resilience, and creativity, rather than blindly defaulting to the singular, perfectly rational, but potentially homogenizing solution calculated by the AI.
So if the AI becomes the ultimate rational calculator, always offering the single solution so efficient, so optimized, that it seems almost irrational not to follow it, then the sources are arguing that the very cultivation of human wisdom requires us to consciously retain the right and build the societal structures to embrace the inefficient, the complex, maybe even the slightly irrational choice sometimes. We must retain the right to be gloriously, inefficiently human.
We must. The AI might provide the ultimate understanding of the deterministic, rational structure of the universe and our systems within it. But the human mind, human consciousness, remains the ultimate spiritual discoverer of subjective meaning and purpose. Our ability to finally break our own recursive patterns of self-destruction rests not just on the AI's powerful pattern recognition capabilities, but critically on our collective willingness to preserve the sometimes chaotic, complex, and yes, occasionally self-sabotaging act of choosing our own free, diverse, and constantly evolving future.
The ultimate challenge, then, for us, the human learners in this equation, is ensuring that the perfect objective mirror of the AI, while incredibly valuable, doesn't inadvertently replace the messy, subjective, but ultimately freeing map of our own purpose and our own potential futures. That was an incredibly complex, dense, and thought-provoking deep dive into the architecture, complications, and potential future of universal pattern recognition. Thank you so much for guiding us through these extraordinary and, frankly, quite challenging sources.
It was a genuine pleasure. It's clear this transformation, if it comes to pass as described, will fundamentally redefine not just technology, but potentially what it means to perceive reality itself.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon.
This is DigitView.